Yes, thank you so much, Fred and Fabrice, for all your hard work and for allowing us to be part of this thrilling, I would call it thrilling.
I would call it thrilling.
Thrilling maiden convention.
Yes. Yeah. Coming back next year.
So my background is as a traditional historian. My PhD is in modern Jewish history. The books I've written until this one were sort of standard scholarly books about the Holocaust, Zionism, Jewish history. So I brought to this project, the skill set of the sort of typical Jewish academic. But Craig comes from a completely different background, and he'll tell you a little bit about himself in a moment. And I like to think of our collaboration in old-fashioned comic book terms as kind of like one of those Marvel team-up issues where you get two different heroes from two different worlds who pool their resources to combat a villain. And not to be too corny about it, but the villain in this generation, the villain is ignorance and apathy, indifference, a desire to forget, or simply the natural disinterest of teenagers in old historical subjects that don't seem to have much connection to them. And as we began the research on Cartoonists Against the Holocaust, that's what we set out. That was our target audience, how to get a 15-year-old, non-Jewish kid in a public school, how to get him to care at all about what happened to Jews in Germany 7 decades ago. It seems so remote, so far off, so distant from his or her personal experience. How do you get kids to think about these subjects, especially in a generation when the survivors, the eyewitnesses, are fewer and fewer? So if you don't have the eyewitnesses, how are you going to get that story across? But Craig, as he'll explain, comes from a completely different perspective that enriched our project in his own unique ways.
Well, I'm into comics. 50 years ago, next year, I published my first fanzine on the history of comics out of my parents' basement. So I've always been into comics. I had some unfortunate segues into being the creative director of the Muppets and Disney and Nickelodeon, but now I'm back doing fanzines about comics. So I've been redeemed. And I think of us as the superheroes as you and I as kind of like Batman and Robin, though. I'm Batman. And you're,
so he says.
And thank you, Robin. We met at a comic book convention. We started talking about the handful of, not much more than a handful of cartoons that Rafi had found on this subject. And I said, as someone who likes to dig into the comics history, including comic books, but including also political cartoons, I said, Rafi, there might be a lot more, maybe even enough for a book, because I published an imprint for IDW called Yo Books. I don't know how I thought up the name, but so clever, right? So I thought this could be a book. We could publish a book about this subject, and it is so relevant and to today.
But I have to say, I didn't think there would be enough cartoons to fill a book. When Craig started talking about it, I thought it sounded like a pipe dream to me, and here's why. The few political cartoons from the 30s and 40s that touched on the Holocaust, which I knew about and which I was bringing to Craig's attention at that point, I had come across them while I was doing research on how American newspapers covered news about the Holocaust at the time. I was looking at it. I wanted to know what did average American newspaper readers know? What did the public know about what was happening? Did we only find out at the end when the Allies liberated the camps, or did we know, or did people know all along? That's what I was researching. And every once in a while, I would come across an editorial cartoon, and it attracted my eye because as a kid, I had been a big comics fan. So it resonated with old adolescent memories of mine. But I didn't find so many of them that I thought that you could actually fill a book. That there were a lot of cartoonists who were drawing a lot of cartoons about this.
Well, I thought it was interesting. You recently said on an interview about the book that I heard you talking about the book, where you said that you almost found the cartoons by accident because you were reading the editorial pages and stuff like that, and then you kind of glanced through when you're going through the microfilm at the page following and once in a great while, a cartoonist would address the subject.
So I took up Craig's challenge. I appreciated the challenge. I wondered if maybe there were more out there that I didn't know about. So I began much more systematic research through old newspapers. But this is really old-fashioned research, let me note, because I was looking at newspapers that generally were not digitalized. So this meant going to the library and cranking the old microfilm machines. Microfilm is a word that none of my kids understand and probably will never need to. But that's how we did research.
I told my kids about the microfilm, and they thought I meant the microwave.
Slowly but surely, more cartoons began to emerge, but it was really needle in a haystack research. And I don't even say that necessarily in a critical way, because a political cartoonist in the 30s or in the 40s had a lot of burning issues in the day's headlines to choose from. A Great Depression, and then later a World War. I mean, they had a lot. There were a lot of topics, and I wasn't shocked that the plight of Jews in Germany or Poland didn't interest them that often. But on the other hand, I have to say that I was pleasantly surprised, if we can use that term, to start to discover more and more that there were cartoonists who were paying attention. And then when we started discovering, for example, that some of them were by Dr. Seuss.
And then also many of the cartoon greats,
Yeah.
Pulitzer Prize winners.
Like Herbert Block of the Washington Post.
Edmund Duffy. I mean,
Other
I'd
Pulitzer Prize
say a third of the, I don't know, a quarter, at least a third of these, or maybe a third of these guys are Pulitzer Prize winners.
Yeah.
They're great cartoonists. I mean, even if they didn't win a blue ribbon, some of these are great. Again, I'm really into old political cartoons, and some of these are the greats.
So I think what began to emerge here were two stories simultaneously. One is the story of what did Americans know, and what were, in this case, political cartoonists telling them. But the other part of the story was that we had a small group of kind of unheralded, I don't want to say heroes, because that word is kind of thrown around a little too much these days, but cartoonists who were using their artistic skill to try to raise the cry, to alert America about Nazism and about the Holocaust. So we were also looking at a group who we admired, because when you study the history of America and the Holocaust, and this happens to be my area of scholarly specialty, it's largely the story of abandonment and indifference. It's largely the story of people knowing and doing very little, people in power, the president, Congress, not caring, not doing much. So to find
Newspaper editors,
that's right. Burying the story on the back pages, if covering it at all. So when we began to find this little group, and they weren't a group in any cohesive sense, they weren't coordinating any of this, but there were a relative handful of political cartoonists who were trying in their own way to do the right thing, to speak out at a time of this great persecution. It was inspiring, and we realized that, okay, we've got really two stories here. We've got cartoonists telling a story, and we've got us telling a story about these cartoonists.
It grew to be more than just a handful of cartoonists, though. I mean, there must be 50 cartoonists in here that eventually, we found did address the subject in a powerful way.
Yes. We want to show you some samples from the book that kind of illustrate some of the trends that we discovered as the research proceeded. Whenever there was something in Nazi Germany which was international news, that's when, of course, there was a much greater chance that I would find a cartoon about it. And so here's the first example. When Hitler first rose to become Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, so everyone knew about it, and a certain number of cartoonists addressed it. This is a cartoon that was kind of emblematic of the naivete that was typical, not just of cartoonists, but of a lot of the public in 1933. The idea that Hitler won't be as bad as everyone fears. That there are, see the big ball and chain says, nice, safe, conservative Czechs. This is the idea, Germany has in place there's a parliament and there is a legal system and there are enough ways to keep Hitler from getting out of control. And the title of the cartoon, as you see in the bottom, just in case he goose steps too much. So don't worry, if he starts to get out of control, there's big Mother Germany, she'll hold him back.
Fred.
The voyage of the infamous refugee ship, the St. Louis, was another event that attracted international attention. This is not always so widely realized today, but it was on the front pages of most American newspapers for 5 or 6 days straight in the spring of 1939, while the ship was first trying to be admitted to Cuba, and then while it was hovering off the coast of Florida, hoping that President Roosevelt would allow those 930 German Jewish refugees to land. While that was going on, it was in the papers every day. And so there too we found some particularly striking cartoons addressing the situation.
The ship, we found Rafi is a superhero that uncovered a story about this ship, and one of the passengers there that relates to the cartoonist, a cartoonist himself.
Which I will get to in a moment.
Oh.
But first I want to show you, we want to show you an anti-St. Louis cartoon. So there were a number like this that were sympathetic, using a famous American symbol of open doors to say, let them in. But look at this one, New York Post, same week. So you've got the 1939 college graduates, but they can't, and they're the ones on the ship now, and they can't get into America because there's no jobs. So it's a hostile take on the St. Louis tragedy. This one was more typical. This, you mentioned Edmund Duffy. This is Edmund Duffy, famous Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist for the Baltimore Sun. He titled this "The Wandering Jew." When I speak in high schools, this cartoon is always the subject of a great discussion. First of all, I explain to teenagers who have never heard of the concept of the wandering Jew, I explain this whole medieval myth that there's a wandering Jew who's wandering around the world for all eternity as a punishment for not accepting Christianity, and that this wandering Jew was supposedly at the site of the crucifixion, and he saw, but he rejected it, so now he's being punished. And they're shocked to hear that this was a legend which was widely believed up until relatively recent times and taught in mainstream churches in the 30s and in the 40s. So when a cartoonist uses an image about the wandering Jew, today I have to explain it, but in those days, people picked up the Baltimore Sun's wandering Jew. Okay, they understood. So Duffy is taking the old stereotype of the wandering Jew with the knapsack on his back and the staff, and he's turned it around, turned it on its head, and he's made the passengers of the St. Louis the wandering Jew of today. But I want to go back now to the point I made earlier. It's hard to get the average American teenager interested in this, to relate to it. Okay, so something involving, Jews in another country a long time ago. What makes this relevant? So here's what I show them in conjunction with this cartoon. I show them another Edmund Duffy cartoon from a few years earlier, which many more people can relate to. So Duffy's cartoon, titled "Maryland, My Maryland," I'll explain the title in a moment, obviously is a very graphic depiction of a lynching of an African American in Maryland in 1931. It set off riots, by the way, outside the Baltimore Sun offices. Riots against the newspaper for, dishonoring the name of Maryland by showing this image. Maryland, My Maryland is the name of the state song. Every state has a song. Nobody knows what the song is. I live in Maryland, and I didn't even know it until I came across this cartoon. And I explained to, high schoolers, think about the irony here. The cartoonist, and here we just saw the same cartoonist, same artistic style. Here he's using his art to talk about injustice on one continent, and here he's using the same artistic style to address an injustice here in our own country. And he's saying, in effect, what has become of our state of Maryland, that this could happen in our State. So, as I say, I use this juxtaposition in presentations to high school students, but I always show what you're looking at now. I show it to the teachers before I come to the classroom. And I spoke at the, I was scheduled to speak at the New Rochelle Middle School a couple of years ago. And the teachers, after looking at this, called me and said, you know, this image is really rough, and it really just might be too much for 12-year-olds to absorb. And she thought maybe I should leave it out. To which I said, well, you know, they're your students and you know best. But from my experience, they will relate a lot better to this stuff if they can also see something like that. And after much discussion among the teachers, they finally said, go ahead and show it, which I did. That teacher contacted me afterwards, just a couple days later, to say that she was really glad that that I'd used the cartoon. She said this cartoon, this one image, stimulated more discussion and more interest among the students than anything else. And it was precisely the use of this harsh image got them thinking, got them talking. It had the provocative effect that I had intended. Now, Craig alluded a moment ago to an amazing backstory involving the St. Louis that we discovered along the way. And it has to do with this cartoonist whose name is Eric Godal. And it's another Wandering Jew cartoon, by the way. Same theme. So Eric Godal was born in Germany. What I'm telling you now, I just learned along the way as we were researching. In addition to finding cartoons, we're also researching about the cartoonists themselves. So Godal had been an artist during pre-Hitler Germany, in Weimar Germany. He'd been rather controversial. He was kind of a racy artist, frankly. And he was on the Gestapo's hit list when the Nazis rose to power. They accused him of being degenerate, plus Jewish, so he had 2 strikes against him. He early in the,
I may be degenerate, but I'm not Jewish, right?
very early in the Third Reich, within the first few months Hitler was in power, Godal one day gets a phone call from someone who identifies himself as a Gestapo officer. He says, come downstairs, you're under arrest. Godal looked outside. I don't know what floor he was on, but he looked out, from his window, and he didn't see any police or SS vehicles parked outside the apartment building, which he thought was very strange, but he thought maybe he had a shot at escaping. So he threw whatever he could into a suitcase, and he went out a rear exit of the building, and sure enough, there was no obvious police presence there, but he just received the phone call. He grabbed the first taxi, headed straight for the border, the Czech border. Went to Czechoslovakia, went to Prague, from there to England, and from there to the United States, where he became a political cartoonist and did cartoons like this. So what was his mystery? Well, he found out somewhat later from friends what had happened. Godal had moved apartments recently. So he had the same phone number, but in the phone book, the Gestapo was using the phone book, right? You couldn't Google him. So the address was his old address. They were outside the building, but they were outside the old building calling the same phone number. And that's how, by the skin of his teeth, he escaped, surely, torture, imprisonment, who knows what else. Okay, so he came to America, did cartoons like this, very striking. And then a couple of years ago, I was doing research in an archive in Jerusalem, where they happened to have a lot of documentation about the whole story of the St. Louis. Because there they have files of Jewish organizations in America that were trying to help get the refugees into the country, into the United States. And there among those files, while I was doing research on the St. Louis, I was doing the cartoon stuff kind of on the side. There I found a letter, a handwritten letter, from a man describing to this Jewish organization, the Joint, if you know the Joint, saying, my mother is on this ship, the St. Louis, and they're hovering here off the coast of the United States. Please, can you do anything to allow her in? I'm her son. I'm already living here. And usually, the way the immigration system worked, usually if you had a close relative already in the country, that made it a lot more likely you could be approved for an immigration visa. So here's this heartfelt handwritten letter begging for her to be allowed in. And I get to the end of the letter, and it's signed Eric Godal. And I thought, it can't be. What are the odds? He's drawing cartoons about the wandering Jew. Could his own mother be on the St. Louis? Then in the file, the next thing in the file is a newspaper clipping from that week. It's from one of the old New York newspapers that no longer exist, the Herald Tribune, perhaps. And the clipping says, "Mother on ship appeals to artist's son in New York." And the article describes how this bereft mother, whose husband apparently had died, so she's a widow, and her son is an artist, but doesn't give his name or her name to protect their privacy. But he's in New York, and she's begging to be allowed to join him. Well, as we all know, the passengers on the St. Louis were not allowed to join their loved ones, not allowed into the United States. Their telegrams to the White House went unanswered. President Roosevelt refused to grant them any kind of a haven, and the ship was forced to return to Europe, where, of course, many of the passengers later were murdered by the Nazis. What about Mrs. Godal? I looked on there's an official registry of all the names of the passengers on the St. Louis, and there's no Godal. I contacted the Holocaust Museum in Washington. They compiled this list. And they said, well, actually, when they were compiling this list a couple of years ago, tracking down all the original people who were on the St. Louis, they said there was one person missing, and Mrs. Goldbaum.
Changed his name.
He had changed his name. His mother was indeed on the St. Louis. That was her. He's the one who wrote that letter. She was sent back to Europe. And she was sent back. When they got back to Europe, they didn't go to Germany. They were divided up. A group went to England, and they survived. Others went to France, Belgium, and Holland, and many of them were killed. She had been sent to Belgium. And after a certain point, her letters to her son in New York stopped arriving, and he knew that his mother had shared the fate of many of the passengers of the St. Louis. So this was a remarkable story. So we describe the story in more detail in the book, of course, but where someone had such a close personal connection to the things he was drawing cartoons about. It's remarkable. So Dr. Seuss, another interesting discoveries, yeah. Very timely, right? So Dr. Seuss, yes?
Did the nature of his cartoons afterwards change?
No, in fact, I'm going to show you another one from Godal later on, which is especially hard-hitting. So I wouldn't say it changed, but I'd say he was consistent. Yeah. In other words, he wasn't like broken by the news and gave it up. On the contrary, he kept trying to raise the alarm. So Dr. Seuss, before he began his career as an illustrious creator of children's books, was a political cartoonist for the now defunct New York City daily newspaper called PM. Seuss did a lot of cartoons, and they're fantastic, and they're all classic Seuss-type illustrations, and a lot of anti-Nazi cartoons, lots of them. Very, very few, though, that had to do with the plight of the Jews. And I don't know the answer. I don't know why that was, because he was already looking at these subjects and carefully following them. But there were a few. And the few that he did on subjects related to the Jews are close enough. Like this one, we included in the book. This is another Seuss cartoon, obviously, just about the most graphic cartoon image I've ever seen depicting events from the Holocaust period. I mean, the sight of the bodies hanging from the trees just...
Yeah, it's kind of ironic. I mean, a beloved who we know as a beloved children's book artist, did probably our most graphic cartoon in the book,
The kicker, the catch line in the cartoon, is he has Hitler and Laval, the French collaborator with the Nazis, has them reciting lines from the famous Joyce Kilmer poem, Trees. So that's it. It's the trees is the connection. This is, again, by the way, something I have to explain to kids because there was a time when trees was required reading, right, in schools, but I don't think that's the case anymore. Certainly, I have not yet met a high schooler who knew what trees was. So, but no, it's an interesting lesson and a little literature lesson as well as a disturbing lesson about the Holocaust. The book contains a few cartoons, but only a few, from the Hebrew language press in those days. So I'm talking about newspapers published in British Mandatory Palestine in Hebrew. The cartoonists there were very interested in the fate of the Jews in Europe, obviously, because they felt it personally. But this is a book, Cartoonists Against the Holocaust is a book about American cartoonists and the American response. We included a few just to illustrate a couple of points, and I want to share one of them with you. If you can see the Hebrew down here, it's called matzilim. Matzilim, which is, so it's a pun. Literally it means rescuers, but it's also the word in Hebrew for lifeguards. Okay, so here you have the two lifeguards identified by their bathing suits and also by, well, Churchill's got the pipe and Roosevelt has the cowboy hat. One of the interesting things that Craig and I found in the American cartoons, we did not find a single case where a cartoonist drew President Roosevelt. And I can just advance sort of some speculation as to why that is. Not a single one. You're going to see a cartoon in a moment where they draw State Department officials, but not the president ever. And I'm going to assume, as a historian, that has to do with the fact that it's the middle of a world war, he's a popular president, they probably did not want to seem disrespectful or unpatriotic. That is my sense. For a cartoonist in Palestine in the 1940s, there wasn't necessarily that sense of reluctance. So here you have a cartoon clearly identifying both Churchill and Roosevelt. The little guy who's jumping off to help the Jews is labeled Schweden, Sweden. So this refers to the famous rescue of the Jews of Denmark, who were all rescued from Denmark and allowed into Sweden, and was known at the time. So here you've got little scrawny Sweden jumping into the swastika-infested waters, while Roosevelt and Churchill stand idly by.
In defense, a small point in defense of cartoonists, maybe, they were employees of newspapers, and their cartoons had to reflect what was written on the editorial page, too. You know, so they weren't. Maybe some of them would have wanted to draw Roosevelt or be more active or do more cartoons, against the Holocaust, but they were beholden also to their editors, not only the public, and maybe they shared the sentiments with the editors and the rest of the public, but I've got to think that some cartoonists just weren't allowed to do what they would have liked to have done stronger or more of.
Now, I think there's something to that. In the pre-war American press, there are lots of political cartoons lampooning Roosevelt, drawing Roosevelt and making fun of him. I'll talk about domestic policies and also sometimes foreign policy. There are many political cartoonists who were advocates of isolationism, and they made fun of Roosevelt for looking like he was, getting America prepared for war. But not during the war itself. During the war, there's a big change in tone.
No, I did a book of anti-war cartoons, and I was following all these cartoonists from these more left-wing newspapers and everything who were like very much against entering, the war and very much against war as a concept, and then Pearl Harbor. The newspapers and the cartoonists, it was just like a complete turnaround. You wouldn't even know they were the same same people. So
they became workers for the United States.
Pardon me?
They were so involved in the war that they just couldn't, they criticized.
Yeah, no, everybody became against the war, and maybe not enough against the Jews, but nearly every cartoon in the paper during the the war years was an anti-Nazi cartoon, but they weren't doing enough to show the plight of the Jews.
Was there any the left before the war, before Hitler invaded Russia, was very much against war involvement and so on.
Right.
And it's probably there might have been a significant number of cartoonists that may very well have been sympathetic to that position.
You mean cartoons in like the American Communist press sort of defending the German-Soviet alliance, so forth. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Yeah. Just real quick, the other Hebrew sample I wanted to show you. So here you have a very explicit portrayal, lampooning of President Roosevelt. The Hebrew at the bottom, Na litrom latzalat Yehudei Europa. The beggar at the door is saying, please contribute for the to the rescue of the Jews in Europe. And Roosevelt is responding, Slicha, zui bevadai taut. Excuse me, surely you are making a mistake. Ainli krovim b'Europa. I don't have any relatives in Europe. So it's a very barbed cartoon, directly challenging Roosevelt in the spring of 1944. This is the other Eric Godal cartoon that I alluded to when you asked earlier. So here you've got State Department officials, and it's a strong cartoon. It's got State Department officials receiving a report about 100,000 Jews being killed monthly by the Nazis, and he's saying, file it away, refer it to committee, investigation subcommittee, section this, blah, blah, blah. They're not interested. So it's a very pointed Godal attack on the State Department, but not, of course, on the president who ultimately made the decisions that the State Department implemented.
And the reason Godal could get away with this, though, is because you'll see that this was in PM newspaper, which they would have been more, willing to go against the State Department because they were started as kind of as a left-wing alternative to all the other more conservative papers in New York. They were very pinko.
Now, I like to pair this one of indifference, of government bureaucrats' indifference, with a more recent one about Darfur. Again, this is something that I show to high schoolers, bring it up to date, show the parallel. Once again, you've got these government bureaucrats here, they're sort of their UN guys, but instead of helping the Darfur victim, they've got a big stack of forms that have to be filled out. I want to show you again two parallels. This is from 1944, it's from our book. A small number of Jews were allowed by the British to enter Palestine in 1944. So you've got 20,000 are being allowed in. You see the great mass of people on the shore who are not being allowed. It says 500,000 Jews to be rescued, only 20,000 being let in. And the title of the cartoon was, what will we do about the other 480,000? Okay, so this drop in the bucket theme, I want to show you a very recent cartoon, and you'll see right away the parallel. Yeah? At 11 million people, and Uncle Sam is celebrating the 10,000th. It's important, I think. It's important to show, especially to students, but the public in general also, cartoons about contemporary genocide, because cartoonists today are not afraid to touch on these subjects. And there should be a whole follow-up book of the cartoons. I don't know about Rwanda. I haven't looked into if there were cartoons about Rwanda, but there have been a lot of strong cartoons about Darfur. There were some. And there are ones about Syria now and others, and they're very impressive. I want to show you in particular this one just a few days ago, the Miami Herald. So the anti-genocide force is dropping word balloons. See? So it's just words.
Try to say it.
Just words. Sorry?
Try to say it. Try to say it.
Yes. It's just, never again. It's just an expression. Put in a word balloon, drop it down. That's going to help Aleppo. Yeah.
What is Aleppo, by the way?
well, Governor Johnson.
Please.
It's an acronym.
We're going to take questions soon, and because we're running out of time, we wanted to tell you a little bit about our next project. And we want to show you the cover.
This is exciting. By some young cartoonists, we're given a shot. He's a guy, we're giving him a break here, and we're going to let Neil Adams, this guy named Neil Adams, do our cover.
We Spoke Out, Comic Books and the Holocaust, to be published next year by IDW. Craig and I have been working with Neil Adams on this project for the past some time. And here's the premise. When I was growing up, in Westchester, by the way, in the 70s, Holocaust education was not a part of the curriculum. Now, today it's New York State law, and it's the law in many other states, but not in those days. And there was no Holocaust museum in Washington to which you could visit. And there was no Schindler's List in the movie theaters. These are all products of the 1990s. So the question is, so how did kids like me, how did teenagers in the 60s and 70s, how did they learn about the Holocaust? And we propose in this book that one of the ways in which some American teens were learning about the Holocaust in those days was through comic books. So the we in the We Spoke Out is comic book creators. Comic book writers and artists who in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s were writing and drawing comic book stories dealing with Holocaust themes. So it's a collection of those stories. We reprint the classic stories, supplemented by interviews with many of the creators and historical background to explain their significance, of whom Neil Adams is one. I'm sure any of you old comic fans, you're veteran comic fans in our audience, you know, for example, Night of the Reaper, famous Holocaust-related Batman story. We have in this book stories from Captain America,
X-Men.
The very first X-Men story to deal with the Holocaust origins of Magneto. But going back all the way to the 50s, to the classic, of course, Master Race, the famous the Bernie Krigstein story, as well as stories from the 60s and 70s, many of them by Joe Kubert, who in some of the war comics address Holocaust themes. So we have a lot of interesting and surprising material graced by this fantastic cover by Neil of a comic book artist drawing about the Holocaust.
Who's publishing?
Yoe Books, IDW.
When, do you have a date yet for publication?
It's going to be about a year-ish till it gets out. The book's 92% done, but it takes a while to get through the system.
So Fred, how much time do we have for questions? Can we take a few?
I think we could stay here as long as you guys want. We have no one after you. But I think, though, might be a good time to take some questions and take advantage of the opportunity to share our ideas about how this is relevant today. I talked to Craig and Rafael, and when we did buy the book, I showed it to my son Josh, who's 15, and his first comment when he looked at it and just took one flip was like, wow, can this translate over to today? So for those of you that haven't invested in the art yet, or haven't invested in expanding your libraries at home, I think this book is a must-have in every school and every home, and right on a cocktail table where you could show it to people and discuss it. So I highly recommend that in today's dangerous, crazy world, that this book be brought. My son Josh, 15 years old, said, wow, you could take this guy's dump and put his face right here and how it translates to today. This world is taking a dangerous turn to the dangerous. And I think that the message that our two guests here today have really something to say. So please, I know there's a limited amount of these that they brought with them, but take one home with you. And please, questions and answers.
Interestingly enough,
Yeah.
we've done some family background, and one of our relatives was named Geisel from Frankfurt am Main's area in Germany.
You know, I'm probably older than anybody here in the room, but.
How old are you?
1937.
Oh.
So.
My math is terrible.
You barely have me beat.
79. I mean, so when I was a young yeshiva student, very young, 6, 7, I knew about the Holocaust. That would have been in 1943. So how do I know about it? Because there are people who denied ever knowing about it until after the war. But there were, apparently, this was common knowledge in the Jewish community. And what I'm curious about is that, and it was obviously pervasive enough that I knew about it because, you know, 6 years old, you know, it would be very unusual if it was not widespread. So I just wondered that whether the actual, you know, existence of the Holocaust was addressed that early in the game.
Well, we use the word Holocaust today. It was not used at that time.
I'm talking about concentration camps and that sort of stuff.
But the information about the mass murder of the Jews, which was typically called extermination, that was the term that was common, it was in the newspapers. Now, I said before, very often it was buried in the back pages. Very often it was buried in the back pages, but it was in the press.
And not only buried, but very small paragraphs or something. You just
Wasn't
kind
there a
of
group of rabbis
Right.
that went to Washington in the early part?
Yes, and so even though it was buried, I was going to say, even though it was often buried in the back pages, on the other hand, the Holocaust went on for years. So there were a lot of stories that accumulated, and a lot of knowledge, a lot of information that became public knowledge, to the point where, in October 1943, over 400 rabbis marched to the White House to plead with President Roosevelt to do something to help rescue the Jews. So,
Feinstein, a few very prominent rabbis.
correct. So although the news did not arrive, it wasn't like today where you have CNN TV cameras like on the spot in Darfur, right, or wherever. So the news was slow getting out, but it did get out. And at first, you know, the reports were fragmentary and uncorroborated, and people had their doubts, and some people thought, oh, they're just atrocity stories like we heard in World War I. But eventually, the accumulation of stories reached the point that it became accepted and widely known, as early as, for example, December 1942. Now think about that date, because that's 2.5 years before the end of the war, before the end of the Holocaust. December 1942, the Allied governments issued a public statement confirming that what they called, again, the mass extermination of the Jews was underway, and millions of Jews were being slaughtered. So the Allied leadership confirmed it, and relatively early on, but unfortunately knowledge did not always lead to action.
Yeah, they were severely criticized for not bombing railway lines in Poland, et cetera. It was, I don't know if it was after.
Yeah, that's.
No, it was at the time. It was during the war itself that there were proposals made to the U.S. government to bomb either the death camps themselves or the railway lines leading to the camps over which Jews were being transported to their deaths. And those proposals were turned down. But no, it was discussed during the actual events themselves.
Well, basically, and this is from the subsequent way that they basically felt there would be one ineffective. But the whole idea was to concentrate on winning the war so then you'd be able to stop.
Well, I'll just say this because we have so little time. The standard explanation, even at the time, was we have to focus on the war. What was not widely known at the time, but historians later discovered, the defense, the War Department, as it was called, they knew, was that American planes were flying directly over Auschwitz at the very time they were saying, we can't do anything about it, it's too hard to reach, we have to focus on the war. Why were they flying over Auschwitz? Because Auschwitz was not just the mass murder area, Birkenau, it was also a series of slave labor camps. It was a big, sprawling complex. Some of those slave labor camps were the Jewish prisoners were being used in factories that were producing synthetic oil for the war effort. So those were military targets, and they were bombed. They were bombed by the Americans, they were bombed by the British. There were bombs dropping on Auschwitz precisely at the time that within a couple of miles, 12,000 Jews were being gassed every day. So the idea that there was a contradiction between bombing the camps and the war effort, that was a myth which the War Department and the Roosevelt administration, they put out at the time, but it was a falsehood.
There's an interesting parallel to today, and that is that the reason for not admitting Jews into the United States prior to the war was the fact that we had a depression, and that basically we don't have enough jobs for the people who are living here. And yet here we have this very same rationalization of immigration and so on.
Okay, so now let's go back a step. Remember the Dr. Seuss cartoon? Dr. Seuss cartoon where she's reading the book Adolf the Wolf and telling the kids, we don't want those foreign immigrant children in? So let me tell you this. You're right. The common argument against allowing Jewish refugees to come in the 30s was, well, it's a depression, unemployment, there's not enough jobs. In 1939, a small number of congressmen proposed a legislation to allow in 20,000 German Jewish children. Why children? So that nobody could say, oh, this is a danger to our jobs. The bill was called the Wagner-Rogers bill. It specified that the children had to be 16 years old or younger. So there's no danger, not going to take away jobs from American citizens. It should have passed without serious objection if the real issue was unemployment and jobs. If the issue was in fact racism and anti-Semitism and anti-immigrationism and nativism, that's another story.
But the
That's another
initial
story.
report was supposed to be Cuba.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something different.
Okay.
There are 20,000 children who never came.
Yeah, but the initial
And-
PSS Hamburg was Cuba, had nothing to do with the United States.
Okay, but I'm talking about something else. This is the one time in this whole period we're talking about where there was a legislation introduced in Congress to allow Jews to come in. There was a big debate, but this is the only time that there was a bill proposed, okay? So it was to allow 20,000 children. Now, it was to be 20,000 children who were German citizens. Had the bill passed, in theory, among the children who could have been admitted, who would have qualified, German citizen under 16 would have been Anne Frank and her sister Margot. Who at that point they were living in exile in Holland, but this is before, of course, they were in hiding, but they were living in Holland. They could have qualified. They wouldn't have taken anybody's job. Because the real nature of the opposition was exactly as Seuss portrayed in that cartoon. It was hatred and fear of foreigners and especially Jews. That was the real problem, because no matter whether they were adults or children, the bill went nowhere. It was buried in subcommittee, was killed.
Contrast this with.
Wait, I'm sorry, before you go, was there someone else who had a question who didn't get to ask yet?
Also, we don't want to send our boys to die to save Jews.
Well, this is before the war I'm talking about. I'm talking about before the war, so that was not quite the issue. Yes, in the back. And then you, sir.
Yeah, I
Yes.
just had a quick question. How aware were people, I don't think they were, how aware were people at the time of FDR's condition? And the two caricatures of FDR, he's obviously, he's able-bodied, or was it?
Yeah, he's a lifeguard.
What's that?
Yeah, right, he's a muscular lifeguard.
Yeah, or was it something,
Who's representing the country.
or was it?
Well, that's true too. But also, the White House staff did a very good job of hiding his illness from the public.
Right, or was it something
Public didn't
that-
know. No, public didn't know.
At the time, just that line had never been crossed. Today, maybe anything goes with any kind of caricature or anything.
Right. No, they kept it quite well hidden. Yes, sir. In fact, by the way, a book was written recently exactly about that, about how Roosevelt's staff worked to keep it hidden and how the press cooperated. Yes, sir.
Two questions.
Mhm.
Was the artist Ben Shawn, who drew pictures about the Holocaust, did he ever do any cartoons for any newspapers or anything like that?
No, not per se.
And the other question was,
He might have done some for the left wing
I never found any.
communist press.
Well, none that we saw.
Yeah, so I don't want to say no.
and the other question is, were there any cartoonists in Germany before Hitler got too popular who made cartoons against him and against what he was doing?
That's a subject I have not yet studied, but that's interesting. But that's not something we've looked into.
And how long did they live?
Yes, in the back. You might have to be the last question. Ari Kaplan has a...
I am here to save all of you.
Dun, dun, dun.
I thought I was going to see something by Arthur Szyk. Is there anything by him?
Oh, we have maybe half a dozen Arthur Szyks in this.
Yeah. Sorry to disappoint you, but we have a lot of his work and his photo in here. He's one of the heroes of the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I kind of figured.
We have some copies of the book here if anyone's interested in purchasing them, and if we run out, we've got a few more upstairs. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rafael.